When a king or a queen died throughout history, the protocols and etiquette of how this would have been dealt with varied on a number of different things. Different countries had different traditions, and different monarchs stipulated their own unique wishes as to how their remains should be dealt with. Some of these were respected, but at other times they were not. For example, following the death of the English Tudor Queen Elizabeth I, good old Bess stated that she did not want to be embalmed, or to have her internal organs cut from her body following her death. The doctors ignored this request and sliced into the final Tudor monarch regardless. When Queen Victoria died, she quietly requested a number of personal items to be placed inside of her coffin after death. Some of these would have upset her own family, but against her wishes and upon the insistence of Kaiser Wilhelm II, her war-mongering grandson, a death mask was cast of her face. This was a final image, a plaster mould of the deceased monarch, and throughout the centuries many of these death masks have been cast. They all show monarchs taking their last breaths, and some even show the moments before their executions. In this documentary, we look at the death masks of kings and queens, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe.
Henry VIII, throughout his almost 4-decade-long reign, would execute some of his closest friends and advisors, such as Cromwell, and also 2 of his wives would end up at the executioner's block in the Tower of London. But the first Tudor king was his father, Henry VII, who defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field, and Henry's victory would end the Wars of the Roses. He was considered a shrewd and careful monarch, and one who did not necessarily show emotion, but following the death of his wife, Elizabeth of York, Henry VII's world changed. He died on the 21st of April 1509 at the age of 52, having an almost 24-year-long reign on the throne of England, bringing stability back to the monarchy. But after his death, a death mask was cast of his face, and it has inspired other effigies of the first Tudor king, and recently technology has been used to bring Henry's face back to life. But what is the story of Henry VII's death mask? As mentioned, on the 21st of April 1509, Henry VII died, and he had been ill since the spring of 1507, and he suffered from a nasty throat infection. It was said that the king for some time had suffered with acute rheumatic fever, and that he experienced bouts of depression and a loss of appetite. It was thought at the start of 1509 that he was suffering from tuberculosis, and on the day before he died, his confessor was summoned to administer the last rites. He was tended to by other members of his household, and the final days of Henry VII were documented by John Fisher, the future executed Bishop of Rochester. It was said that the king died a good Christian death, and that his last days were not peaceful, and that they were filled with confession, prayer, and the emotion of Henry VII's life came out. He was weeping constantly, and he received the sacrament of penance with a marvellous compassion and flow of tears, that at some time he wept and sobbed by the space of 3/4 of an hour. Henry VII had then prepared himself for death. It was said that same day of his departure he heard Mass of the glorious Virgin, the Mother of Christ, to whom always in his life he had a singular and special devotion. The image of the crucifix many a time a day, full devoutly, he did behold his with great reverence, lifting up his head as he might, holding up his hands before it, and often embracing it in his arms with great devotion, kissing it, and beating often his breast. Who may think that in this manner was not perfect faith, for may suppose that this manner of delaying he faithfully believed not that the ear of the Almighty God was open unto him, and ready to hear him cry for mercy. Henry VII was in agony, not for the dread of death only, but for the dread of the judgment of Almighty God, and he was worried and stressed about what would happen to his soul after his death. He was praying heavily for mercy, but then in his final moments came. He succumbed to tuberculosis, which was a very nasty death, and he left the throne to his eldest alive son, Henry VIII. Now Henry VIII's reign would change history forever, but following his death, Henry VII's body remained at Richmond Palace for some time until the funeral arrangements were finalised. He was then embalmed, and at some point a death mask would be cast of the first Tudor king. A death mask was a wax or plaster cast of someone important's face after their death, and it was done as a moment of the dead. The death mask of the first Tudor king was cast before he was taken to his funeral, and most likely during the embalming process, but it had a very important purpose, as today, using it, we can see what Henry VII looked like and what his appearance was like in his final years. His death mask was used to create his funeral effigy, and this shows a man sitting upright with short cropped black hair and with his eyes wide open and mouth pursed closed. It shows the king having asymmetrical features and shows him looking rather stern. It's believed that the effigy was made from the death mask and that this effigy sat on top of the coffin when it was taken into Westminster Abbey, where he was then interred inside the ornate and huge lady chapel that he had commissioned to be a place of royal burials. The death mask was made to form part of the funeral effigy, and it sat on top of Henry's casket. Thousands inside of London would have seen their king's final form in this wooden image that sat on top of the horse-drawn hearse. It showed many people in London their king for the first time, as during the Tudor times it wasn't common for the people to even know what the monarch looked like, and many wouldn't have been able to recognise him if they saw him, as it wasn't common for people to even see portraits of the king. But the lifelike effigy would have shown the people who was inside the coffin, and it would have been dressed in Henry's robes and showed him true to life. Henry in the effigy also looks rather ill and gaunt, in opposition to the variety of paintings that were created of him, showing his longer flowing hair and bright-coloured countenance. Another image would be made of Henry VII after his death, and this was a bust made by Torregiano, and it shows the king's clad in fair-lined gown and a black Tudor-style hat. He looks as if he is contemplating something, but he is certainly looking more healthy, and it's believed that when this was made, the bust used the death mask and the effigy to create the sculpture. Using this death mask, he then tried to make the king more lifelike and alive, and show him in his younger and more glorious years. It's believed that this bust was also a plan or a starter on the bronze tomb effigy which would be placed on his resting place in Westminster Abbey. Henry VII as a king was known for being a man who, after the Wars of the Roses, managed to bring the country under control. His marriage to Elizabeth of York united the country following the turbulence of the previous civil war, and he would deal with many disputes in a serious manner. He used justices of the peace to keep order for him, but his final years were marred by worry, tragedy and upset. Henry VII's life was rocked by the death of his heir and eldest son Arthur, but also then the loss of his wife Elizabeth of York. These tragedies greatly upset the man who was considered emotionless and staunch, and after Elizabeth's death his health suffered, and he would succumb to a nasty bout of tuberculosis. One of the most shocking executions of the Tudor period was when Elizabeth I signed the death warrant of Mary Queen of Scots. The former Scottish monarch and the cousin of the English Queen was a thorn in the side of Elizabeth after she had been involved in a number of plots. Mary Queen of Scots had been imprisoned in England for almost 2 decades before she came ingrained with the Babington plot, which was planned to dethrone and assassinate Elizabeth and put the former Scottish Queen on the English throne. Catholics across the nation would have loved this. However, Elizabeth then sanctioned Mary's death and execution. It was inside the walls of Fotheringhay Castle on the 8th of February 1587 that Mary made her way to the executioner's block. It was a remarkable moment in English history, the Queen ordering the execution of another queen. But with the executioner's axe, Mary's life was no more. But one curiosity which has emerged in the centuries after her death relates to a number of death masks taken of the Queen's face following her execution. Mary would not be given a public funeral, but she would be given a death mask. This is a haunting image of the deceased former Queen of Scotland. But what is the story behind it? Mary was informed on the evening of the 7th of February 1587 that she would be executed in the following morning. She remained in prayer in the final hours of her life, and she wrote her will. All whilst this was happening, inside the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle, a scaffold was being created, which was being draped in black cloth. It was not huge, and it had 2 or 3 steps to access it, and it was also complete with a cushion for the Queen to kneel on. There were also 3 stools for witnesses to observe the proceedings. It would be an executioner named Bull, who would take the head of the former Scottish monarch, and he appealed for the Queen's forgiveness, and Mary replied with, "I forgive you with all my heart, for now I hope you shall make an end of all my troubles." Mary was attended on by 2 loyal servants and ladies, and they helped her take off her outer garments. Mary was blindfolded by Jane Kennedy, who placed a white material blindfold over her eyes, and she then positioned her head on the low block. The executioner and his assistant would be directed by Mary stretching out her arms by giving the signal that this was time for the axe to fall. But Mary's execution did not go straightforwardly, and it was in a sense botched. The first blow from the axe missed her neck completely, and the axe was embedded in the back of her head. This would have been excruciating, and could have been enough to kill the former Queen of Scotland on its own. But it's not known whether the executioner, who was considered skilled, would have been nervous or would have lost his nerve in the final moments. But the execution had been described as a sombre occasion, and that the executioner followed all the proceedings of a high-status execution of the time. After the first blow missed, the second blow was more successful, and the axe almost severed her neck, but her head was still attached by a small part of sinew. The executioner then moved his axe blade forward and back a few times, and the head of Mary Queen of Scots fell onto the wooden scaffold beneath the block. Following this, the executioner then picked up her head and shouted, "God save the Queen!" And as this happened, the auburn wig she had on her head slipped. And disturbingly, the head of Mary fell onto the floor, and Mary was shown to actually have short grey hair at the time of her death. A witness would state that Mary's lips stirred up and down for a quarter of an hour after her head was cut off, and as the blade of the axe fell the second time, a small dog owned by Mary came out from under her skirt. Following the execution of Mary Queen of Scots, a remarkable series of events took place. Elizabeth I turned in her opinion of the proceedings, and she became greatly upset and angry at the execution. She believed she had been superseded in the order by her Privy Council. However, because of the anguish and upset, Elizabeth would be hesitant to initially bury her former cousin. In the moments after the execution, the authorities took great steps to ensure that Mary Queen of Scots' clothing, possessions and belongings were not considered relics. Anything inside the Great Hall of Fotheringhay that had touched her blood was burned inside of the fireplace, including the scaffold, and this was done to stop relic hunters. Her clothing and even the executioner's block was thrown into the fireplace of the Great Hall too. It's not known whether the executioner's axe was, but it's probable, as a possession of the executioner and as his trusty weapon, he was allowed to keep this. But Mary Queen of Scots had wished to be buried inside of France with her first husband, but sadly this was refused. Because of this, after her death, her body was embalmed, and then it was left in a secure lead coffin until she would be buried months later at Peterborough Cathedral in the July of 1587. It's not known whether Mary's head was sewn back onto her body or not. Some royal executions, for example, when Charles I lost his head, was performed when the axe fell, but then the head was sewn back on before burial. It is at some point whilst she was at Fotheringhay Castle that she must have had her death mask cast on her face. There have been a number of death masks that have emerged relating to Mary in the centuries after her execution, and it was tradition for kings and queens at the time. It's believed that there were 4 death masks cast of her face after her death. 2 of these are still in existence and can be seen today. The death masks amazingly show the executed Queen of Scotland's face in a rather interesting state. They show her with a peaceful and calm countenance and do not show any signs of trauma, panic, anguish, or stress. Her eyes remain closed, her lips clasped tight, and her face looks almost as if she is asleep. One of the Queen's death masks is referred to as Lennox Love Mask, and it's belonged to the Duke of Hamilton, and they kept it at their estate in Lennox Love for over 250 years. It was kept in a casket, which also shockingly contained some of Mary's possessions. Inside of this casket, along with the death mask, was a sapphire ring and also the casket letters. For centuries and decades, the death mask had not been displayed in public, but today it can be viewed. The other death mask of Mary Queen of Scots that survives is known as the Jedburgh mask. This was first discovered in Peterborough when she was initially buried, before she was taken to Westminster Abbey. What is interesting is that the two death masks do not look the same. It would have been believed that they would have been identical if, inside the walls of Fotheringhay Castle, the death masks were cast at the same time. Her face would not have changed expression or anything. The Lennox Love mask is smaller and is much more basic, but the Jedburgh mask was painted, and it was decorated to make it look like Mary had makeup on during her death. Also, it has a wig attached to it. The Jedburgh mask is displayed among other memorabilia belonging to Mary and other documents at the Mary Queen of Scots house in Jedburgh, where it's believed that she stayed when she rode to visit James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell. Interestingly, also on display here is a watch that belonged to the Queen, which was found in a bog and then in a molehill. The original appearance of Jedburgh death mask would have been white and unembellished. When it was found in Peterborough by Dr. Charles Hepburn of Glasgow, it was said to have been hand-printed. Today, the authenticity of the death masks is questioned also. The death masks would have been cast, if legitimate, in the hours directly after Mary Queen of Scots' execution. It would have been done before the coffin was sealed that contained her remains, and she would, after this, have been laid to rest inside a room of Fotheringhay Castle for some months. It's believed that there are 4 death masks, and today 2 of these remain lost to history, but they may be in the collection of some Scottish household or earl. The death masks that do survive are very different, but both cast a haunting figure of Mary Queen of Scots' moments after her execution, and the moments after her head had been brutally taken off by a blundering executioner. But they show her almost in a serene state of calm, which is not in keeping with her final moments. One of the most influential and heroic queens to ever rule England was Elizabeth I, the Tudor monarch that her father, Henry VIII, would have been proud of. Elizabeth faced many challenges throughout her life, from questions about her strength, due to the fact she was a queen and not a king, to the threats from the Spanish Armada that she managed to see off and defeat. She would, throughout her reign, execute many people who she believed were religious dissenters, but she would also execute Mary Queen of Scots, her cousin, who had plotted to bring about her death and downfall. But Elizabeth in her final months of life was a shadow of her former self. Portraits showed her standing strong and tall, and as if she had a hand on the world, but her final days were spent very differently. Following her death, she had a death mask cast of her face, which shows the haunting look of the Queen, who by the time she died was suffering greatly. But what is the story of her death mask? Elizabeth I reigned for around 45 years, and she was the final Tudor monarch, as she died without having a child. Her reign was a golden age in which writers such as Shakespeare were creating incredible works and performing them in theatres around London. But during her final years, the Queen's health would deteriorate over time, and her close friends began to pass away. Some of her closest ladies that remained with her for decades were getting old and dying, and Elizabeth I would then fall into bouts of depression. In 1590, Blanche Parry, one of her closest ladies, died, and Blanche had known the Queen since she was a princess, and was even the chief gentlewoman of the Privy Chamber, and also the keeper of the Queen's jewels. Blanche's death upset Elizabeth greatly, but then in 1598, Another one of her close friends, William Cecil, her trusted advisor, would also die. Cecil had backed the Queen for decades, and as she was losing her trusted friends, Elizabeth began to retreat and become more isolated. She drifted from the court that she once commanded and became distant to it. In her final years, she would also execute Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. Devereux was one of her favourites, but he had been charged with high treason after being involved in planning a rebellion which included kidnapping the Queen. In January 1603, Elizabeth I was not very well at all. She was in a deep depression, and she retired to Richmond Palace, which she loved. She believed this was a good place for her to retire into her old age, and whilst at Richmond in her final months, she remained with her loyal ladies. Elizabeth, whilst here, would turn down food and drink, and she lost a lot of weight, and her ladies became very worried about her. They asked doctors to come and examine, but Elizabeth refused to allow them to see her. She would also be hit by the sorry news that another long-serving lady, Catherine Howard, the Countess of Nottingham, had died. She had served Elizabeth for around 45 years, and this seemed to really tip her over the edge. It was said that the Queen loved the Countess well, and hath much lamented her death, remaining ever since in a deep melancholy that she must seemeth be overtaken. She was very frail, and was almost 70 years old, but she remained stubborn and in charge. However, she refused to rest at times, and she stood for long periods. It was believed that she was, in thought, contending with her impending death, and in the final days of her life, she became rather contemplative, and also rather guilt-ridden. She worried about the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, and it was said she shed many tears and sigh, manifesting her innocence, that she never gave consent to the death of that queen. She also began to be visited by ghostly visions of Mary, and it was clear that Elizabeth was dying. Her health was failing, and her mind was also, and she would make the decision to retire to bed. She summoned the Archbishop of Canterbury to come to her side and to pray for her soul, and he told Elizabeth I that she would go to heaven and would be a queen in heaven. On the 24th of March 1603, the Queen died, and her body was then taken from Richmond to Whitehall Palace, where it was watched over for 3 weeks. However, at some point following her death, a death mask was taken of the final Tudor Queen. There were many questions that remained after her death, including the succession of the King of Scotland, invited to also rule England. However, a mould of her face was taken, and what is interesting is that it shows the Queen looking very different to the portraits that were painted throughout her life. It showed an ageing Queen who hid behind the mask of youth, and the death mask of Queen Elizabeth I would later inspire the design of her tomb. She was shown with a pensive look, and the effigy which was made of her would also be complete with her ruff and jewels. It was common at the time for people to take death masks of high-profile people, and they were used to make funeral effigies in tombs, but also to act as a reminder of the person who died. Elizabeth I was shown looking rather old, and this would have been true to her final last moments. Today the tomb in Westminster Abbey, that is based on her death mask, is colossal, and it shows the Queen complete with a crown and headdress, and it does show her importance and riches. There are a number of possible illnesses or problems that could have killed Elizabeth I. It's believed that the Queen may have had blood poisoning based on the lead makeup that Elizabeth wore to cover up the smallpox scars that she was so self-conscious of. Another illness proposed is that the Queen had cancer, or that she may have had an infection that turned to pneumonia and took the Queen, as she would have been older and had a weaker immune system. The Queen was embalmed, and it would have been during this time that the death mask was made. Those who did this process, such as physicians, would have made the Queen look comfortable and relaxed in her death state, and this is how the death mask would have been cast. Today, Elizabeth I is buried in Westminster Abbey, and her body was first placed into a vault by her grandfather, King Henry VII. However, James I would order the creation of a huge monument and tomb, and she was interred inside of this, and in the same vault as her half-sister. Elizabeth, interestingly, was placed above Mary I. showing her importance over Mary in history. Her tomb reads, "Consorts in realm and tomb, here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary, sisters in hope of resurrection." Many people lamented her death, but there were others who had high expectations of the Stuart king James I. But over time, this would wane, and within 15 years of her death, Elizabeth had a heroic reputation in society at the time. She was shown for being a brilliant queen who had done so much, from defeating the Spanish Armada to trying to unite religion, but her death mask is interesting, as it shows us a realistic image of the final Tudor queen who would control everything that was painted of her to make sure that she stayed young and looked incredibly powerful, even when this was not the case. One of Britain's longest reigning monarchs who also oversaw the Commonwealth and Empire was Queen Victoria, a woman who also was known for being the Empress of India. Her life was long, as was her reign, and she was 81 when she died on the 22nd of January 1901, within the rooms of Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. It was her favourite residence and house, but there was a significant amount of chaos after her death, as no one had a clue as to how to deal with her funeral, as simply no one was alive who had witnessed or planned a royal funeral before. However, there was a lot of secrecy also regarding her death, and Victoria's doctor even smuggled a number of secret items into her coffin, as he believed that Victoria's last wishes would be offensive to the royal family if they were known about. But one wish of the Queen, which was shockingly ignored, was the decision to cast and mould a death mask of Victoria. This was something she did not want, but the influential and later warmongering Kaiser Wilhelm II, her grandson, would insist on this. But it shows a harrowing and haunting image. Victoria, by the final part of the year 1900, was clearly sick and she was not well. She had suffered a very tough year, with her eldest daughter suffering with an aggressive breast cancer, and also many of her family members had died of various causes. But she herself was ill, and she had lost a significant amount of weight, and she did not eat like she used to. She was an elderly woman in her 80s, which for her time was significantly elderly, and she was pushed around most places in a wheelchair. But Victoria also had a lot of confusion. She wrote in her diary that, "Another year begun. I am feeling so weak and unwell that I enter upon it sadly." Victoria had been for some time inside of her house on the Isle of Wight, Osborne House, where she spent many Christmases. But her health went downhill, and the royal doctors decided to then summon the royal family to the Isle of Wight, as things did not look good. She was in her final days, even more confused, but her daughters could not see what was coming, and they seemingly believed that the Queen would live forever. And even Kaiser Wilhelm II, the German emperor, was fetched to say his goodbyes. The British newspapers also knew what was happening, and they began to speculate, and then reports as to what was occurring within the palace walls. Each day the media were ringing and telephoning every few minutes for an update. Government business was forced to stop for a brief period as the Queen was on her deathbed, and the Queen had experienced a number of significant strokes, and she could not do her duties because she was incapacitated. Also summoned to her bedside was the Bishop of Winchester and a local priest who prayed for her soul, and they chanted and sung hymns, and doctors continued to provide her with reassurance. However, the royal family were crying, and they seemingly accepted that death was on the horizon. They certainly did when they were ordered into the bedroom, one by one, to say their goodbyes. It was around 6:30 on the night of the 22nd of January 1901. The Queen Victoria, at the age of 81, died inside of her small bedroom. The news regarding her death emerged even before Edward VII had accepted the crown, and then the news of her death spread across continents. St. Paul's Cathedral bells tolled, as did all churches, and shop windows were covered in black mourning cloth. But inside of Osborne House there was much more chaos, as no one knew how to plan a full military state funeral. But Victoria had left a number of specific instructions as to what should happen and what shouldn't happen to her body and remains following her death. She did not want to be cut open and did not want her internal organs to be removed or placed into different boxes and sites. But during the embalming process, there was a death mask cast of Queen Victoria's face, and it certainly is not the most flattering, neither is it the most positive final image of the long reigning queen. Queen Victoria did not like death masks, and she hated them, considering them macabre and haunting, and she did not have one cast of her husband, Prince Albert, but instead had his hand cast in plaster. Victoria specifically stated she did not want a death mask made of her, and she wanted people to remember her as the Empress of India and the Queen of Britain, the powerful and wielding queen, and not a woman who had withered away, got old and suffered in her final days. But during the chaos with planning her funeral and the plans to move her remains back to London and the mainland, Kaiser Wilhelm II ordered the royal doctors to make a death mask of his grandmother, and in the confusion this was done. It was the Earl Marshal and the Lord Chamberlain who argued about who should plan the funeral, and they could not decide on this, and because of this, a number of issues would emerge during the funeral itself. But Kaiser Wilhelm II would have the death mask made against Victoria's wishes. Now, death masks were usually cast straight after death, and it would later be used to make tombs and effigies of the death, and in some cases even statues that were supposed to immortalise important historical figures. However, Kaiser Wilhelm's order must have been carried out in the moments after her death, during the embalming process, when few other people were inside the room, including the royal family, who would have known this was not what she wanted. They would have voiced their opposition, but many members of the royal family did voice their discontent later, and they were offended by Wilhelm's demands as they believed it violated the wishes of the Queen. The mask itself is a rather horrible image, and it shows the Queen's eyes very tightly shut and her lips closed also, and it's not flattering and looks rather ugly. It was not the way Victoria wanted herself remembered. But Kaiser Wilhelm later may have took the death mask back to Germany, and then of course he would later be one of the main reasons behind the outbreak of the First World War. Further issues emerged regarding Queen Victoria's funeral and the planning and preparations of this, and the royal undertakers, when they were summoned to the Isle of Wight, even left her coffin in London. The coffin had been made for decades, but then a local carpenter was asked to hastily make a coffin for Queen Victoria to be buried inside of. The funeral procession itself was massive, and there was even a huge crossing of the Solent in which the Alberta, her yacht, held her coffin, was flanked by battleships and the Royal Navy vessels. But even during the final part of the funeral, the gun carriage Victoria was placed on broke away, and it could not be stopped, and this caused problems, and was then ordered to be pulled by hand by sailors. But the death mask cast of Queen Victoria shows a horrific image of her in her final moments. She would have wanted to have been remembered for being the woman who oversaw a great deal of change during her long reign, as Britain became an industrialised nation, and she would not have wanted the image of a sick old woman to have been placed in all of the newspapers. The request made by her grandson may have been what they did in German circles, but it was not how the British wanted to do things, and it was done against the wishes of the Queen, who was very image conscious.